My position also allowed me to travel on Air Force One with Mrs. Nixon. The president had asked her to represent him at the inaugurations of the presidents of Venezuela and Brazil in March of 1973, right before her birthday. This was the first time I really got to know Mrs. Nixon. Although an intensely private lady, she was warm, relaxed, and funny. She had such a beautiful smile, and as we all know, and she made everyone on the plane feel really comfortable in her presence. She made a point of chit-chatting with each and every person on the plane, from the crew members to the staff members, and finally to each person in the press corps who occupied their own seating compartment in the rear of the plane. And we all know that there wasn't any real reason for her to be joyful about doing that. This was my first assignment where it was my responsibility to brief the First Lady on her schedule each day and see that her day ran smoothly. I was so impressed by her gracious manners to her hosts, her friendly ways with those who were always trying to get close to her, and her compassion for the children and orphans that she visited. She was elegant but not pretentious. And there was a wonderful surprise on the way home. It was Mrs. Nixon's birthday, March 16th. We blew up balloons and toasted her with champagne and cake. The trip had gone well, and everyone was ready to celebrate and let their hair down. We did not fly back to Washington, D.C., but we flew to Nashville, Tennessee. The evening was the dedication of the new building for the Grand Ole Opry, and President Nixon was dedicating it. A very wonderful thing happened after that. He played Happy Birthday on the piano to Mrs. Nixon, and as an encore, he belted out his rendition of My Wild Irish Rose. And you could see on Mrs. Nixon's face how very touched she was, almost to the point of tears. Later that summer, in June to be exact, Mr. Nixon scheduled the next U.S.-Soviet summit, and it was determined that it would be at the Western White House in San Clemente. So Lucy Winchester, accompanied by her 3 assistants, me included, flew to California in a small White House jet ahead of time to make the necessary arrangements. It had long been tradition that Nixon's staff stayed at the San Clemente Inn, but this time the Soviets were to stay. They were going to be the ones to stay in the inn. We were quite put out as staff members and decided to take small revenge, and Lucy had an unsurpassed reputation for playing devilish practical jokes. So we went to the store and we brought rolls of saran wrap and spray starch. And then ostensibly to deliver their welcome packets to each Soviet room, we short-sheeted each bed. We spray starched their towels until they stood by themselves. And best of all, we tightly saran wrapped each and every toilet seat and then put down the lid as if it were part of an American sanitary custom. And we laughed ourselves silly at the image of the Russians splashing themselves and not being able to tell a living soul about it. Later that year, I accompanied the President and Mrs. Nixon to Belgium and later to the Soviet Union for the summit meeting in June of 1974. I was given this wonderful assignment because the social secretary ordinarily did not travel out of the country. In Belgium, we stayed at the Hilton, and those staff members who had been to the Soviet Union before, and I do believe Colonel Brennan was one of those, they encouraged us to put some toilet paper in our suitcase so we would have something soft to use when we got to Russia. And then it also was highly recommended that we borrow a Hilton bath towel or 2 because in the Soviet Union, the toilet paper was 000 sandpaper, and the towels were so thin you could see through them. And the towel turned out to be 1,000 times better than a tip for the maid who cleaned the room. It was my job to coordinate the arrangements for the reciprocal state dinner that the Nixons would be hosting for the Brezhnevs in Moscow. The dinner was held at the U.S. ambassador's home, and yes, it was big enough to hold a state dinner. The menu was planned around filet mignon, because beef was a delicacy not available in the Soviet Union in those days, and it was flown over for the occasion. So, while the superpowers discussed salt and détente, I, accompanied by an escort, who was really my KGB attendant, was on a reconnaissance mission around Moscow, looking for fresh flowers and other things that we could decorate and use for the state dinner. In my wanderings, all I ever saw were gladiolas. That's what was in season there. And I found out that gladiolas were the flower of death in the Soviet Union, so in the end, we couldn't use those. And so in the end, the flowers were flown over with all the other parts of the dinner. The vegetables, fruits, and flowers, along with the beef, came via airplane. We White House staffers learned only too quickly why beef was considered such a delicacy to Russians. It simply did not exist there. For the entire 3 weeks of the trip, we ate hot dogs and canned peas. The exception to this was the state dinner hosted by the Soviets in the Kremlin. And we ate an unknown delicacy, something called jelly-bellied musterfish. And to this day, I don't know what I was eating. Anyway, back to the hot dogs. At breakfast, they were on the menu as sausages. At lunch, they were on the menu as pepperoni. And at dinner, they were on the menu as pork chops. On the plus side, the caviar was plentiful and delicious, and the strawberry ice cream was divine. One of the stops was to Yalta, where President Nixon and Mr. Brezhnev had discussions on his yacht in the Black Sea. The staff stayed behind in a local Black Sea resort hotel, and I will never forget the beach in front of the hotel. In fact, I don't know if you saw the photo out there, I brought it. There was not a grain of sand or a little rock. Actually, I think the beach was little gray rocks, but you couldn't tell because there were so many people on it, and to get to the water, to get to the seashore, they had to climb over each other. I found out why the crowds. In the Soviet Union in those days, each family was allowed a 2-week vacation, paid for by the state. Sounded good until I learned that they didn't get to choose when or where they went. It was decided for them by the state. The flight back to America was unforgettable. It was the 4th of July, and we had had our fill of hot dogs, being followed and spied on. And when the pilot announced that we were entering international airspace, spontaneous applause erupted throughout the plane.